It's a little past 6 in the morning in late June, and the air over Rundell Farm in eastern Wisconsin already smells like wet dirt and diesel. Not the good kind of dirt smell either, the kind that means the ground's been rained on and then baked, rained on and then baked, over and over, until it's hard as a sidewalk in some spots and mud soup in others. Somewhere past the third row of squash, something is very obviously eating everything. You can hear it before you can see it, honestly. That papery crunching sound of a few hundred cucumber beetles working through a leaf at the same time. Get close enough, and the leaves look like they've been shot with buckshot. Little round holes clustered, so tight the leaf can barely hold its own shape anymore. Half the pepper plants are stripped, down to bare stems with the pepper still hanging there. Ridiculous, like ornaments on a dead Christmas tree. A four-wheeler sits by the equipment shed with a flat tire nobody's gotten around to patching. Farther back, an old Ford tractor that hasn't turned over since March. But if you'd walked the fence line that Tuesday morning, you wouldn't have heard an engine at all. You'd have heard chickens. A lot of them moving fast, and 3 boys yelling at each other about whose turn it was to carry the water bucket. The oldest is Dawson, 14, tall for his age, and a little too proud of it. The middle one is Cole, 12, quieter, the kind of kid who reads the manual before anyone tells him to. And then there's Bo, 9, who at that exact moment was standing inside the pepper row with a chicken under each arm like he'd personally rescued them from a burning building. None of these boys had ever taken an ag class. None of them had a 4-H ribbon. What they had was a 22-acre vegetable operation that was about 6 weeks from losing its biggest customer, a mother who hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night since March, and a bug problem that had already chewed through one growing season and was working on a second. Rundell Farm had been supplying a restaurant in Green Bay for 11 years, a farm-to-table place called the Copper Kettle that put Rundell Farm heirloom tomatoes right there on the menu in italics. That contract wasn't huge money, but it was steady money, the kind that pays a mortgage payment every single month, whether the rest of the season goes well or not. Boy's dad, Pete Rundell, had run the place mostly by feel. He didn't keep spreadsheets. He kept it in his head, which row got sun first, which soil needed lime, which years the Japanese beetles came early. When he died of a heart attack out by the hay barn in February, all of that went with him. His wife Angela had helped run the business side for years, the invoices and the taxes, but the actual farming instinct, the stuff that told you a pest problem was coming 3 days before it showed up, that was gone. By June, the damage was everywhere. Cucumber beetles on the squash. Japanese beetles skeletonizing the bean leaves down to lace. Squash bugs laying eggs on the undersides of everything green. Angela had sprayed twice already that season with an organic pyrethrin product because the Copper Kettle wanted things grown without synthetic chemicals, and both times the bugs were back within 9 days like nothing happened. The Copper Kettle's chef, a woman named Renata, called in the second week of June. She was polite about it, but direct. "Angela, I love you, and I love this farm, but I've got a menu to run. If the tomatoes and peppers I'm getting keep looking like they went through a wood chipper, I've got to look at other suppliers. I can give you until the 4th of July, 3 weeks. That was the whole ball game. Angela called the county extension office the next morning. The agronomist who came out, a guy named Todd Behrens who'd been doing this job for almost 30 years, walked the rows with a clipboard and didn't sugarcoat anything. "You've got 3 different pest populations overlapping at once, Angela. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a farm's been stressed for a full season, and the natural checks and balances break down. Real talk. A commercial synthetic spray program, applied on a strict rotation, is going to be your fastest fix. The organic stuff you've been doing isn't going to cut it at this scale." "Renata won't take synthetic," Angela said. Todd shrugged, not unkindly. "Then you might be looking at losing that account." "I'm sorry. Sometimes the math doesn't care what we want." Angela sat in her truck in the driveway for 20 minutes after he left. She didn't cry, exactly. She just sat there with both hands on the wheel like she was driving somewhere, except the truck was in park and the engine was off. It helps to understand a little about who Pete Rundell actually was, because the way this story gets told later, 3 kids, some chickens, a saved contract. Skips over the fact that this family was still raw. Pete had been the kind of dad who narrated everything he was doing, whether the boys asked him to or not. Checking soil moisture by grabbing a fistful of dirt and rubbing it between his fingers. Telling Bo, who was maybe 6 at the time, that a good farmer listens more than he talks, and the dirt talks slower than people do, so you gotta be patient. Bo didn't understand it then. He still doesn't fully understand it now, honestly, but he remembers the exact tone Pete said it in, and sometimes he'll repeat the line almost word for word without meaning to. He died on a Tuesday in February, out by the hay barn, doing something as unremarkable as checking on a water line that had frozen overnight. Angela found him an hour later. There wasn't a dramatic goodbye. There wasn't time to prepare. 1 week the man was arguing with Dawson about whether the tractor needed new tires before spring, and the next week Angela was sitting at the kitchen table with a funeral home brochure and 3 sons who didn't fully know how to be sad yet, so mostly they just went quiet. Spring came whether the family was ready or not. Seeds don't wait for grief to finish. Angela planted what she could remember Pete planting, and roughly the rows she remembered him planting them in, and hoped that would be close enough. For a while it was. Then the bugs showed up in numbers nobody in the family had the instinct to predict, because the person who had that instinct wasn't there to read the signs anymore. Here's the part nobody puts in the highlight reel. The idea for the chickens didn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It came out of an argument. Cole had been quietly obsessed with a video he'd watched twice. Some Australian guy running chicken tractors through vegetable rows, moving portable pens every couple of days so the birds worked one section at a time. He brought it up at dinner. Dawson shut it down immediately. That's a hobby thing, Cole. That's not. We've got 22 acres. You're going to move a chicken pen around 22 acres? Not all of it. Just the sections that are bad right now. Look, Cole had actually printed out a page, which embarrassed him a little when Dawson saw it. Chickens eat beetle larvae out of the soil before they hatch. That's the whole thing. You don't spray the bug. You eat the bug before it's a bug. With what chickens? We don't have chickens. We could get some. With what money? I've got $90 saved, Cole said. From mowing the Hendersons' place all spring. $90 doesn't buy chickens, a coop, feed, and fencing. Cole. It doesn't even buy the fencing by itself. So we ask Mom. Mom's got a chef giving her 3 weeks. You want to go to her with, hey, can we buy chickens right now? Better than doing nothing. We're not doing nothing. We're spraying. The spraying isn't working. Dawson, that's the whole point. You were literally standing in the bean row yesterday saying it isn't working. That's where it usually would have died. Except Bo, 9 years old, half paying attention, mostly eating mac and cheese, said, Grandpa Ray had chickens. There's still a coop back by the tree line. I saw it. Everybody stopped. Grandpa Ray was Pete's father, dead almost 10 years now, and the co-op Bo was talking about had been sitting, empty and half collapsed, behind the wood line since before any of the boys were old enough to remember it in use. Angela hadn't thought about it in years. That weekend, Dawson, still skeptical, but curious enough to go look, found it under a decade of blackberry vines. Rotted in places, but the bones of it were solid and stuffed in a rusted coffee can. Nailed to the inside wall was a stack of index cards and handwriting, none of them recognized until Angela confirmed it was Ray's. Pest rotation, beetles worst in squash and beans, move birds every 2 to 3 days ahead of the worst section. Don't let them sit still or they'll strip it bald. Fence line co-op, portable pen, 40 to 50 birds dozen acre in a week if you keep them moving. One card near the bottom just said, asterisk asterisk spray kills what you can see. Birds kill what's still in the ground, asterisk asterisk. Angela wasn't sold right away. To be fair to her, let's fight a 3-week deadline with chickens is not a sentence that inspires confidence. She called Todd Behrens back and asked him, point blank, if it could actually work at this scale in this time frame. Honestly, I've seen it done on smaller operations, done well over a full season. 3 weeks is aggressive. I wouldn't bet the farm on it. Then, after a pause, but it wouldn't hurt to try it on a section while you figure out plan B. That was enough for the boys. Not for Angela. She still wanted a backup plan, but enough that she agreed to let them try it on the 4 acres of squash and beans that were worst hit, while she kept negotiating with Renata for more time on the rest. They didn't have money for 50 hens from a hatchery. What they had was $340 in birthday and lawn mowing money between the 3 of them, and a livestock auction happening that Saturday 2 counties over. Dawson did the bidding. Angela made him practice the hand signal in the kitchen twice because he kept second-guessing himself, and they came home with 38 mixed-breed layers. Mostly older hens. A bigger operation was culling from their flock. Cheap because nobody else wanted birds that were past their prime egg-laying years. Cole didn't care. We don't need eggs. We need bug eaters. Old hens eat bugs, same as young ones. They spent that Sunday dragging the old coop frame out from under the blackberries, patching it with scrap plywood, and building a portable run out of step-and fence posts and poultry netting borrowed from a 4-H family down the road who thought the whole thing was equal parts hilarious and sweet. It took most of the day just to get the frame usable. One whole wall had rotted through and had to be rebuilt from a stack of pallet wood Dawson found behind the equipment shed, cutting it down with a hand saw because the good saw's battery was dead and nobody wanted to drive into town for a charger on a Sunday. Bo's job, self-assigned, was pulling nails out of the old boards with a claw hammer, nearly as big as his forearm, a task that took him roughly 4 times, longer than it should have, and left him with a blood blister he showed off to anyone who'd look at it for the rest of the week. By 6 that evening, they had something that could generously be called a coop, and a length of netting strung between metal posts that wobbled every time the wind picked up. Angela came out to look it over before dark, hands on her hips, and didn't say much beyond, well, it's something, which from her, that week, counted as encouragement. Hash hash, what the neighbors had to say about it. Word travels fast on a road with maybe 11 houses on it. Their neighbor Gary, who ran beef cattle and had opinions about basically everything, stopped his truck at the end of the driveway just to yell out the window, "You boys running a petting zoo now, or you actually gonna farm this year?" The feed store clerk in town, ringing up 38 bags of layer feed and a roll of poultry, netting for a 12-year-old, asked flat out if his mom knew he was spending this much money on yard chickens. Even Renata, when Angela mentioned it on a call, mostly to buy a little goodwill, a little more time, went quiet for a second and then said, carefully, "That's certainly a plan," in the tone people use when they don't want to say what they're actually thinking. The worst one, though, came from a man named Harlan Voss, who farmed the 60 acres directly behind Rundell land and had known Pete since they were kids. Harlan came by one evening, ostensibly to check on Angela, and ended up standing at the fence watching the boys drag the pen forward a few feet. Pete would have had this sprayed and done in an afternoon, Harlan said. Not cruel, exactly. Just certain. You're letting these kids play farmer with a real customer on the line. That's a real gamble, Angela. Angela didn't have a great answer for that one. She just said, "I know," and went back inside. Adults weren't the only ones with opinions. Cole, going into 7th grade that fall, had already been dreading how he'd explain the whole thing to kids at school, and the dread turned out to be justified. A kid named Tyler, who'd never once set foot on a working farm in his life as far as anyone could tell, started calling him Chicken Boy within the first week of school, and it stuck around longer than Cole would have liked. It wasn't vicious, exactly. Middle schoolers rarely go for vicious. It was worse in a way. It was just relentless low-grade mockery, the kind that shows up in hallway comments and gets repeated by kids who weren't even there for the original joke. Bo, still in elementary school, got a gentler version of it. Some kids thought it was cool, actually, which surprised him. He came home one day proud because a girl in his class asked if she could come see the chickens sometime. Dawson, being in high school, mostly avoided the teasing altogether, either because 9th graders had bigger things going on or because nobody wanted to say chicken boy to someone 6'1" who played linebacker. Cole didn't tell his mom about most of it. He told Dawson once late at night, half joking, half not. Maybe this was a dumb idea. Dawson, who 6 weeks earlier had been the loudest voice against the whole plan, surprised him by not agreeing. "The bean rows don't care what Tyler thinks," he said. "Numbers on your legal pad don't care either." It wasn't exactly comforting, but it was enough to get Cole back out to the coop the next morning. Here's what the highlight version of this story skips. The first 10 days were genuinely bad. The portable pen, cobbled together out of borrowed parts, blew over in a windstorm the second night, and the boys spent a Tuesday morning before school 40 minutes, chasing 38 panicked hens through wet grass in the dark with flashlights, half of them still in pajamas. Dawson was furious. Cole was near tears, trying to explain that this wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't what the video showed. Bo just kept trying to hug chickens that did not want to be hugged, getting pecked twice for his trouble. 3 days later, a hawk took one of the hens in broad daylight, right in front of Bo, who didn't talk about it for 2 full days afterward. The rotation schedule Cole had so carefully mapped out fell apart almost immediately. Once real weather and real chicken behavior got involved. Hens don't move on a spreadsheet. Some mornings they'd refuse to leave a section that still had bugs in it. Other times they'd strip a row bald in a day and a half instead of 3, leaving Dawson scrambling to move the pen a day early with dirt under his fingernails and his mom's car keys in his pocket because he needed to run to the hardware store for more fence posts before it closed. There was also the morning, about a week and a half in, when Angela found Cole sitting on an overturned bucket by the coop before school, not doing anything, just sitting there with the legal pad closed in his lap. She asked what was wrong. He said the beetle counts had gone up 2 days in a row instead of down, and he didn't understand why, and he was starting to think Todd Barons had been right about the whole thing being a long shot. Angela didn't have an answer for him either. She sat down on the ground next to the bucket in her work clothes and just stayed there with him for a few minutes before either of them said anything else. Dawson had his own low point involving the truck. He wasn't technically supposed to drive it alone yet. He had his permit, not his license, but he took it to the hardware store for fence posts anyway, because the pen was falling apart faster than the schedule allowed for, and Angela found out only when the hardware store clerk mentioned it to her at the grocery store 2 days later. That fight lasted most of a Saturday. Dawson wasn't wrong that the posts were needed urgently. He was still grounded from driving for 2 weeks regardless. Angela, watching all this some evenings from the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hand, thought more than once about calling Renata and just telling her it wasn't going to work. Harlan's voice kept replaying in her head. Asterisk, you're letting these kids play farmer. Asterisk, but she also watched her boys arguing about beetle larvae at 8 in the morning with the kind of intensity she hadn't seen from any of them since Pete died, and something about that kept her from picking up the phone. Nobody can point to the exact day it started working. That's the honest truth of it. It wasn't a single dramatic morning. If you'd asked any of the 3 boys in the moment, they probably would have told you it wasn't working at all. That's how slow this kind of thing moves when you're the one living inside it, checking leaves every morning and mostly seeing the same damage as the day before. It was more like Angela walked the squash rows on a random Thursday, about 12 days in, and realized she'd gone 4 rows without seeing a live cucumber beetle. Not 0, just noticeably fewer. Cole started keeping actual records after that, on a legal pad instead of the whiteboard he'd wanted. Dawson vetoed drilling holes in the shed wall. Beetle counts on 10 random leaves per section, twice a week. The numbers weren't dramatic on any single day, but stacked week over week, the line went down in the sections the chickens had worked and stayed, roughly flat everywhere else. The bean plants in the worked sections pushed new growth for the first time in weeks. Real leaf, not lace. The squash, which had been half defoliated, started setting fruit again where it had mostly stalled out before. By the last week of June, with 4 days left before Renata's deadline, Angela drove 3 crates of squash and green beans to the copper kettle herself instead of waiting for the usual pickup, because she wanted to see Renata's face when she opened them. Renata didn't say much at first. She turned a squash over in her hands, checked the underside for the beetle damage that had been there 2 weeks earlier, and didn't find it. "This is actually good, Angela. What did you change?" Chickens, Angela said. My boy's idea. Renata laughed, but not the mean kind. Keep the account, obviously. Just keep doing whatever this is, she asked, half out of curiosity and half because she liked a good story for her menu. Descriptions? If she could come out to the farm sometime and see it for herself. Angela said sure, expecting it wouldn't actually happen. Restaurant people are busy, and a 20-minute drive out to a working vegetable farm isn't most chefs' idea of a day off. But Renata showed up the following Tuesday, in real boots instead of restaurant shoes, and spent almost 2 hours walking the rows with Cole, who'd brought his legal pad along without being asked, narrating beetle counts like he was giving a TED talk. Renata later put a line on the dinner menu that fall, Rundell Farm squash, chicken tended mostly as a conversation piece for customers who asked about it, which it turned out quite a few did. Your dad would have gotten a kick out of this, she told Angela on her way out, not knowing quite how much that would land. She'd met Pete a handful of times over the years, mostly at farmers markets, always talking too long about soil. Angela didn't trust herself to say much back. She just nodded and said, yeah, he would have. Harlan Voss didn't show up to apologize or anything like that. That's not really how it goes in real life. But he did stop his truck again about 3 weeks later, longer this time, and actually got out and walked the fence line while Dawson moved the pen forward. How many bags of feed you going through a week now? Harlan asked, which was as close to an olive branch as the man was capable of. Little over 2, Dawson said. Less than what a spray program would have cost us, according to Mr. Barron's. Harlan grunted, looked at the bean rows, which by then were thick and green and climbing their trellises, the way they were supposed to. Your dad used to say the land tells you what it needs if you slow down enough to hear it. I always figured that was him being sentimental. He paused. Maybe not. He didn't say much else. But the next week, Cole caught him asking their mom, quietly, what breed of hens they'd used and whether he could borrow the boys for an afternoon to help him figure out if it'd work on his own place. The part that actually made this a story people outside their road knew about didn't come from social media at first. It came from the Outagamie County Fair in late July. Cole entered his pest count records, the actual legal pad, beetle numbers and all, into the youth ag exhibit almost as a joke, mostly because his 4-H friend down the road talked him into it. He didn't expect anything. He definitely didn't expect to place, let alone place first in the youth conservation category, beating out kids with actual FFA chapters behind them. A local news reporter covering the fair for a slow news day, human interest piece found the display more interesting than she expected. A handwritten est log next to a photo of 3 brothers dragging a chicken pen through a squash field, and asked if she could interview the boys on camera. Dawson did most of the talking, because Dawson always did most of the talking, but it was Bo's answer that ended up getting clipped and shared the most. The reporter asked him why chickens instead of spray, and Bo, completely serious, said, because the chickens actually like their job. The tractor never liked anything. That clip went up on the local news station's page that Friday. By Sunday it had been picked up and reshared by a couple of bigger farming and homesteading accounts, and by the following week, Angela was fielding calls from 2 other regional restaurants, asking if Rundell Farm had room for new accounts. Tyler, the kid who'd been calling Cole Chicken Boy since September, apparently saw the clip too, because he showed up at Cole's locker that Monday, a little awkward about it, and said his mom had seen it and made him watch it, and it was actually kind of cool. I guess Cole didn't quite know what to do with that. He said thanks. That was more or less the end of the nickname, not because anyone apologized outright, but because it's hard to keep calling someone Chicken Boy, like it's an insult. Once the local news has run a segment on him winning a countywide award for it. Even the fair judges seemed a little thrown by the whole thing. One of them, an older woman who'd been judging the youth conservation category for over a decade, told Angela afterward that she'd never seen an entry quite like it. Usually it's essays about recycling, not a working pest management log from an actual working farm, and asked if Cole would be willing to come back the following year and maybe help judge the entries below his age bracket. Cole said he'd think about it, which is 12-year-old for yes. Nobody got rich. That part matters, because it's the part that makes the rest of it believable. Rundell Farm kept the copper kettle account, picked up one smaller restaurant client, and finished the season with the squash and bean yield actually higher than the year before, not because of some miracle, but because the plants finally got to keep the leaves they grew instead of losing them to something eating through the middle of the season. The chicken flock grew from 38 to just over 70 by fall, once they started hatching a few of their own, and Angela finally gave in and let them buy some proper young layers too. The co-op got rebuilt properly. No more blackberry vine archaeology required. Dawson, who'd been the most skeptical of the three at the kitchen table back in June, ended up being the one who mapped out a full farm rotation plan for the following spring in a notebook, in his own handwriting this time, next to his grandfather's index cards, which they'd laminated and kept in the co-op. Cole's pest logs turned into an actual system Todd Barron started referencing when he talked to other small growers in the county, half joking that a 12-year-old with a legal pad had out-monitored some operations with real budgets. And Beale got his line about chickens liking their job printed, unofficially, on a hand-painted sign that now hangs at the farm's roadside stand. Asterisk, asterisk, Rundell Farm grown with chickens that actually like their job. Asterisk, asterisk. Harlan Voss put in his own trial run of chicken tractors on 8 acres the following spring. He still complains about the fence repairs. He hasn't stopped doing it. Gary, the cattle guy who'd asked if they were running a petting zoo, never did apologize for the comment, not directly. But he did start buying eggs from them every couple of weeks. Cash, no small talk about it. Like the whole thing had just quietly settled itself without needing a conversation. Angela kept Grandpa Ray's laminated index cards in the coop through the winter, and by the following spring she'd added a few of her own, in her own handwriting, tucked in alongside his, mostly things the boys had figured out by trial and error that Ray never wrote down because he never had to. Some of it contradicted his notes slightly. Weather patterns had shifted some in the decades since he'd farmed the place, and what worked for him didn't always work exactly the same way now. She figured that was fine. He probably would have adjusted too if he'd been given the chance. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's probably not the tidy one people want to hear. That a bug problem got solved by a bird nobody respected isn't really the point. The point is closer to what Ray Rundell wrote on that index card a decade before any of his grandsons ever read it. Spray kills what you can see. It doesn't touch what's still coming. Sometimes the fix that actually holds isn't the fast one. It's the one that deals with the problem before it becomes a problem again next month. 3 boys didn't save a farm because they were smarter than the adults around them. They saved it because they were willing to try something slower, messier, and less certain than a chemical with a guarantee on the label, and because, for whatever reason, they were the only ones in the family with the time and the stubbornness to chase escaped hens through wet grass at 6 in the morning without giving up on the idea by the second week. Angela says now that the hardest part wasn't the bugs. It was trusting 3 kids with something that actually mattered, instead of protecting them from the possibility that it might not work. It worked. Not perfectly, not overnight, and not without a dead hen, a blown-over pen, and a lot of arguing at the dinner table along the way. But it worked. There's a version of this story that ends with a bow on it. Kids save the farm. Town comes around. Roll credits. Real life doesn't quite do that. Cole still gets frustrated some mornings when the numbers don't move the way he expects. Dawson still argues with his mom about the truck. Bo is, at time of writing, campaigning hard for a goat, which Angela has not agreed to, and probably won't for a while yet. The copper kettle account is still just one piece of a business that has good months and rough ones, same as it always did, same as any small farm does. What's different isn't that the hard part went away. It's that the family found something that made the hard part feel worth doing. Again, a system. 3 boys built out of a rotted coop, an old man's index cards, and a stretch of stubbornness that came from somewhere none of them could fully explain. Maybe it came from Pete. Maybe it just came from 3 kids who didn't know yet that they were supposed to think it wouldn't work. Either way, the fields are clean. The chickens are still out there most mornings, moving a little farther down the row than they were the day before, doing a job nobody taught them. Exactly. But that somehow they've never once needed convincing to do. If this one hit different, if it reminded you that sometimes the people everyone underestimates are the ones actually paying attention, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.